What's going on, everybody? So in this video, I'm going to show you how to install T1-11 or LP Smart Siding on your shed or outdoor structure. This is going to show you how to position the sheets in place, how to fasten them, how to make sure the overlap and underlap edges are meeting up properly, and finally, just some tips and tricks on how to get a good installation. With that said, let's get into the video. What's going on, guys? So this video is all about how to install shed siding, but if you still need to learn how to frame your shed, you can check out my previous videos in the description. So T1-11 and LP Smart Siding are very similar, and they're the most common shed siding options in my opinion. They're basically a 4x8 sheet of pressure-treated, engineered plywood paneling. I personally think LP Smart Siding is a little bit better, but I have a blog article comparing the two that you can check out in the description. So a successful LP Smart Siding installation starts with planning. In this case, we framed our wall so that the total height, once the bottom was positioned on our ledger board, would land directly in the center of the double top plate at the top. That way we could use a full 8-foot sheet. So for my shed, I used a piece of trim board at the bottom, which will serve as a ledger that we can rest our siding on as we install it. So for my ledger board, I used 3.5-inch PVC trim that I pre-painted black, but if you're not planning on installing trim, you can just put a few temporary nails in at the bottom and you can rest the siding on that. But in my case, I'm using this trim and I attached it to the shed frame base with screws, but in hindsight, I should have just used some brad nails because covering those up later with caulk was a pain in the butt. So I'm using 8-foot long segments, so I'm filling in the partial sheets there, and then I repeated this process around the entire perimeter of the shed. Now, if you plan on installing a shed ramp at the front, you don't want a piece of trim going the entire length. Instead, you want to plan out how wide your shed ramp is going to be, and you want to cut your trim so that it goes on either side. So after installing the PVC ledger trim at the bottom of the shed base, we can now use that as a ledger to install our panels of LP Smart Siding. Now, I recommend that you pre-paint your panels. I just find it's easier, but you can obviously install the panels and paint them later. I'm just using my Graco paint sprayer, and I highly recommend this for big paint jobs. So at this point, it's time to install the first panel, and the first panel on each wall is the most critical because it's going to set up the success of the remaining panels that you install. So these panels have an overlap edge and an underlap edge, and you want to have the underlap edge positioned in the center of a stud as shown. This means that when starting, you're always going to have your overlap edge in the corner. So in this case, the corner is towards the front of the shed. So I have my overlap edge there, and I'm making sure that it's perfectly in line with the front of the shed, and I want to make sure that it's perfectly plumb and square all the way across. You want to make sure that you have the same distance at the top plate, which is going to indicate that your shed is square. If you're skewed now, it's going to throw you off for the rest of your panel installations, so definitely take care when installing this first sheet. As you can see, I'm using a bar clamp to hold it in place, and if you planned out your wall framing appropriately, the underlap edge should land directly in the middle of a stud. Now, I'm using screws here just to temporarily hold it in place. I don't know why I did this. I have a framing nailer and I used it later on, but a framing nailer is definitely going to be a lot easier to fasten this with than screws. With the first piece of siding tacked in place with a few screws, I grabbed a second sheet and I positioned it in place. So as you can see in the figure, the second sheet of SmartSide panel is going to be installed so that the overlap edge rests on top of the first panel's underlap so that it touches the alignment bead as shown in the figure. You're then going to fasten through the second panel and through the first panel through the overlap using a fastener that embeds a minimum of 1.5 inches into the stud. But because we have a window here, what I did is I just got it in place and I used a bar clamp to temporarily hold it where it needs to be. Then I went on the inside, I marked the window cutout with a Sharpie, and then I just pulled that panel off and made the cuts. For me, this is easier, but you could obviously measure this instead of putting it on and taking it off. So to cut out the window penetration, I used a circular saw and I just made 4 plunge cuts. You're going to need to hold the guard out of the way to make these, and these are a little bit tricky, so definitely be careful and keep safety in mind. Now with the circular saw, you're not able to go all the way in the corners without overcutting, so I used a jigsaw to cut out the corners and get everything cleaned up. So once we cut out the window, we can actually position the panel in place for real this time and permanently fasten it to the shed. I used a few screws again just to hold it in place, and I'm going to go back later with a nail gun and hit all the intermediate studs. So at this point, we have our first 2 panels installed. One panel has the window cut out, and now we need to install the partial panel towards the back. As you can see, this is going to be a 2-foot wide segment, and because these are 4-foot by 8-foot panels, that means we're going to need to cut one of these panels in half lengthwise. So to cut these LP Smart Siding panels, I just used a tape measure to mark the 2 feet, used a chalk line to establish the cut line, and then I used some 4x4s underneath the piece of siding to get it above the ground and ran a circular saw across. Nothing groundbreaking there, but after making the cut, we're going to position the overlap edge so that it's on top of the underlap edge that we installed on the second sheet by the window. And now I'm finally using the correct piece of equipment, which is a framing nailer. And I'm using 2-inch exterior rated galvanized nails, and I'm using nails every 8 inches on center or so. On the back wall there, you want to ensure that the piece of siding is completely flush with the back wall and that it's not poking out, and then go back and hit all the intermediate studs with nails. Sometimes it's tough to identify where those studs are located behind the siding, so you can either measure from the edge based on your stud spacing, or there I'm showing that I marked where the stud is at the top and the bottom so that I have a reference line to make sure that I go through the siding and into a stud every 8 inches on center. Here I am going back and installing nails every 8 inches on center for the piece of panels that I installed with screws. Again, don't know why I did that. I should have used nails from the start. Now at this point, we've installed the LP Smart Siding on the sidewall. Now we can move on to the back wall. Again, we're going to have our overlap edge positioned so that it is flush with the outside of the wall there. Then I'm using the temporary screws again stupidly. You can see we're going to have a butt edge there. Don't worry about that because we're going to cover it with trim in a later video. So here you can see that that first panel is lining up directly in the center of a stud, so that when we install the overlap edge of the next sheet, it's going to be directly in the center of a stud. So here I am taking the second sheet, positioning the overlap edge of the sheet in my hands on top of the underlap edge from the sheet we installed in the corner, making sure that everything is lining up. I want to make sure that my spacing at the top plate is the same all the way across, and also that the underlap edge is lining up in the direct center of a stud, which it is. Then I'm going to go back and install nails every 8 inches on center. Now we're going to install that partial sheet. Again, we're going to cut that piece of panel to size using a circular saw. Keep track of the underlap and overlap edges when you're cutting so you don't make a mistake. Now we're moving over to the final sidewall. As you can see, we marked the window penetration again, and we're doing the plunge cuts just like we did on the first sidewall. And then we're going to use the jigsaw to clean everything up. And then we're putting it in place so that the overlap edge goes on top of the sheet we installed previously, and that cut section is towards the back corner. Now, this LP Smart Siding installation is going to go so much smoother if you planned out your stud spacing so that every underlap and overlap edge is going to land exactly where it needs to in the center of a stud. So if you want the plans and the exact stud spacing I used for my 10x10 shed, you can check the link in the description. Okay, so the last part of the LP SmartSide installation is to cut the panels for the front wall of the shed. So to get the look I wanted on the front of the shed, I went a little bit rogue and I installed the LP Smart Siding horizontally instead of vertically on the front. This involved a 4x2 panel and a 2x2 panel. So just like before, I used a chalk line to cut my panels to size. There's a smaller 2x2 panel, and I'm getting the underlap edge so it's positioned towards the top, and then I'm installing nails every 8 inches on center, and then I'm positioning the overlap edge of the 4x2 panel on top of the underlap edge of the panel we installed below, and then I'm making sure that it's flush on the outside corner as well. Here I am doing the same thing for the other side. I'm marking the cut line with the chalk line. I'm going to cut it to size with a circular saw. I'm going to install the 2x2 panel, make sure that it's perfectly level, install nails every 8 inches on center, making sure that the panel is flush with the outside corner and also the inside there where the door's rough opening is, and then more nails every 8 inches on center. And I forgot to paint this panel, so I'm doing that now. So at this point, we've successfully installed LP Smart Siding on the shed. In the next video, we're going to be installing trim on the outside corners and on the side of the shed, as well as installing the plywood sheathing and the veneer. So definitely subscribe if you don't want to miss when those videos drop. Check out my shed plans in the description. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll catch you on the next one.